Battle of Chosin Reservoir, the frozen hell that forged American heroes. Chapter 1. Into a Frozen Hell. Night falls early and unforgivingly in the mountains of North Korea. In late November 1950, a brutal wind howls across the desolate hills around the Chosin Reservoir. Imagine yourself there, a US Marine huddled in a shallow foxhole, scratching at iron-hard frozen ground. The temperature is plummeting to 30 degrees below zero. Your breath turns to ice on your scarf, and your fingers are numb on the trigger of your rifle. Around you in the darkness, a few thousand fellow Marines and soldiers cling to their positions on icy ridges and valley floors. They are exhausted and far from home, but they are resolved to hold their ground. They don't know it yet, but they are completely surrounded by a vastly larger enemy force. In the eerie silence of the frozen night, a faint, otherworldly sound suddenly carries through the thin mountain air. Bugles. Dozens of Chinese bugles and horns blast from the darkness, accompanied by shrill whistles and the clash of cymbals. Moments later, all hell breaks loose. White-clad figures pour out of the hills in every direction, firing rifles and screaming battle cries. The American perimeter erupts in muzzle flashes and cries of alarm. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir has begun in earnest, a battle later remembered as a frozen hell that would push human endurance to its limits and forge a legend of heroism and survival. This is the story of that harrowing winter campaign. Over the next 2 weeks, 30,000 United Nations troops, mostly US Marines and soldiers, would fight their way through encirclement by approximately 120,000 Chinese in the bitter cold of North Korea's mountains. It would become one of the most intense and iconic battles in American military history. As you follow this tale step by step, picture the scenes as if you're watching a gripping war drama. Young men facing impossible odds, frostbite gnawing at their limbs, yet finding reserves of courage and camaraderie that turn ordinary soldiers into heroes. The frozen hills of Chosin would test every ounce of their resolve. The outcome would hang in the balance, not only determined by bullets and bayonets, but by the sheer will to survive in nature's cruelest conditions. How did these troops end up in such a predicament? And how did they manage to escape annihilation, turning a potential disaster into a testament of valor? Let us step back a bit to set the stage for this epic confrontation. Chapter 2. Prelude to Disaster. Pushing north to the Yalu. In the autumn of 1950, the Korean War appeared to be nearing a triumphant conclusion for United Nations forces. After North Korean armies had invaded the south that summer, US-led troops fought bitterly to hold a foothold at the Pusan perimeter. But with a bold landing at Incheon in September, General Douglas MacArthur's forces turned the tide. By October, UN forces had recaptured Seoul and driven deep into North Korea. There was talk in the high command of being home by Christmas. The 1st Marine Division, along with other army units, were ordered to advance northward toward the Yalu River, the border with China, aiming to reunify Korea under a non-communist government. Spirits were high. Many believed the war would be over in weeks. However, unbeknownst to most on the UN side, blind China had other plans. Alarmed by the rapid UN advance, Mao Zedong had secretly sent the Chinese People's Volunteer Army across the Yalu in late October. Moving only at night and hiding by day, tens of thousands of Chinese troops infiltrated the mountains of North Korea without being detected. They took up positions in the rugged terrain, waiting for the right moment to strike. Despite some signs, firefights involving Chinese volunteers in late October, the UN command in Tokyo and General MacArthur downplayed the threat of full-scale Chinese intervention. MacArthur was supremely confident, to the point of ignoring warnings and urging his forces onward. The result was that by mid-November, UN troops were stretched thin over vast distances. The 8th Army advanced in the west, while in the east, 10 Corps, which included the Marines and several army units, drove into the remote mountains around a man-made lake called the Chosin Reservoir, known as Changjin Reservoir to Koreans. The terrain at Chosin was forbidding. A single, narrow, winding road snaked from the coastal port of Hungnam up through steep mountain passes to the high plateau around the reservoir. Major General Oliver P. Smith, commander of the 1st Marine Division, was uneasy about advancing so deep into this wilderness, with his division spread along 78 miles of perilous road. He famously noted that the mountains of North Korea were never intended for military operations. Smith took precautions, establishing supply depots and small garrisons at points like Hagaru-ri and Koto-ri along the road. But he had to follow orders. Under pressure from his superior, Major General Edward Almond of 10 Corps, Smith sent his regiments forward. The 7th Marines and 5th Marines moved to the village of Udam-ni on the west side of the reservoir, the farthest northwestern point of advance. On the east side of the huge frozen lake, an army formation, the 31st Regimental Combat Team, a task force of the 7th Infantry Division, later called Task Force Faith, took up positions near Sinhung-ni. Between Udam-ni and the division headquarters at Hagaru-ri, Smith placed a single company of Marines, Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, on a crucial mountain pass called Toktong Pass. This tiny force was to guard the road linking Udam-ni to Hagaru, effectively keeping the only exit route open. The Marines at Fox Company's hill outpost joked grimly that they were the cork in the bottle. As November wore on, the weather turned fiercely cold. A Siberian cold front settled over the mountains. By late November, temperatures at Chosin Reservoir plunged to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, -29 degrees Celsius, and even lower at night. The Marines were somewhat prepared. They had been issued winter parkas, insulated boots called shoe packs, and gloves, but nothing truly prepares you for patrolling in Arctic cold. Vehicles had trouble climbing the icy, narrow road. Fuel and oil thickened. Sea rations froze solid. The men would heat cans of food on small stoves or fires when they could, but often they choked down frozen biscuits and chocolate. Frostbite became a constant threat. Everyone was ordered to keep wiggling their toes and fingers, to change socks frequently, to never stand still too long. As one Marine recalled, if you stopped moving, you froze. Despite these hardships, morale remained fairly high in late November. Many Marines enjoyed a traditional turkey dinner on Thanksgiving Day, November 23rd, even in the field. A brief taste of home. The very next day, General MacArthur flew to a nearby base and confidently announced the final offensive to end the war. The stage was set. Little did the UN troops know, they were marching into a trap. Chapter 3. The Trap Springs. China's Sudden Onslaught. On the night of November 27, 1950, the trap was sprung. Without warning, waves of Chinese attackers descended upon the isolated UN units around the Chosin Reservoir. It began at Udam-ni, where about 8,000 Marines of the 5th and 7th Regiments had dug in for the night. In the pitch black around midnight, the Chinese 9th Army Group unleashed a well-planned assault. Bugles echoed through the mountains, a Chinese signal to attack. And next thing the Marines knew, their perimeter was assaulted from all sides by overwhelming numbers. The Chinese soldiers, many wearing padded white uniforms that blended with the snow, came charging in human waves. They blew whistles and rang gongs to confuse and disorient the Americans. Suddenly, hundreds of enemy were in the wire, firing rifles, throwing grenades, and rushing the foxholes. The Marines fought desperately to stem the tide. Tracer rounds and flares streaked into the night, illuminating scenes of chaos. Men shouting orders, machine guns rattling, mortar shells exploding on the hillsides. Some Chinese were armed only with grenades or old burp guns, but sheer numbers made them dangerous. If one wave was cut down, dozens more seemed to appear out of the darkness to take their place. The fighting became hand-to-hand in places. On one hill, a Marine private found himself swinging his entrenching tool, a small shovel, in close combat when his ammunition ran out. Bayonets were fixed and used in brutal melee. It was a nightmare come to life, as if an endless swarm was trying to overwhelm the defenders by sheer weight. A similar drama played out simultaneously on the eastern side of the reservoir, where about 3,000 US Army troops of Task Force Faith were positioned. They too were hit by multiple Chinese regiments. But unlike the Marines at Udam-ni, these soldiers were more scattered and less experienced. They had no warning before thousands of Chinese overran their forward positions. Chaos erupted along the frozen shores of the reservoir as army units tried to regroup under fierce assault. Communication lines were cut. Some companies were completely surrounded on isolated hills. The commanding officer of the task force, Colonel Alan McLean, went out in the dark to find one of his beleaguered units and was captured by the Chinese. Leadership fell to Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, who, despite the shock of the assault, began organizing a defense and a possible breakout. But Task Force Faith's ordeal was only beginning. We will return to their story shortly. Back at Udamni on that first night, the Marines managed to hold their main perimeter, but only just. By sheer grit and with the help of concentrated artillery fire, they repelled wave after wave of attackers. A young Marine later described firing into masses of oncoming silhouettes until his rifle barrel glowed red-hot in the frigid air. Casualties were mounting. When dawn broke on November 28th, the extent of the situation became clear. The Marines at Udamni were completely encircled. Hundreds of enemy bodies littered the snowy approaches to their positions, a testament to the carnage of the night. But many of their own were dead or wounded as well, and Chinese snipers now took shots at anyone moving. There was no safe rear area. Every direction pointed toward enemy-held ground. The surprise was total. The Chinese had achieved complete tactical surprise, surrounding the UN forces in a matter of hours. One isolated outpost, however, remained crucial. Fox Company at Toktong Pass. This single Marine rifle company, around 220 men, under Captain William E. Barber, had been dug in on a barren hill overlooking the road. In the middle of that chaotic night, Barber's men suddenly heard the unmistakable sounds of battle erupting all around them, not only at Udamni ahead, but also behind them toward Hagaru-ri. Soon, they too were attacked. A Chinese battalion swarmed their hill. In the first rush, Fox Company's lines were partially overrun. One platoon was almost wiped out. Private Hector Caffarata, standing guard, woke to find Chinese troops in his position. He famously grabbed his rifle and fought them off, even hurling back live grenades with his bare hands despite being wounded. Captain Barber himself was shot through the leg on the second day of fighting, but he refused evacuation and propped himself in a foxhole, continuing to direct his men. Throughout the nights of November 27th and 28th, Fox Company held Toktong Pass against all odds, denying the Chinese the ability to cut the road completely. Their stand was absolutely vital. If Fox Hill fell, the route between Udamni and Hagaru-ri would be severed, and the bulk of the Marines might be truly trapped with no escape. Barber radioed to headquarters that his Marines could hold for a while, but relief would eventually be needed. They were isolated and running low on ammunition and medical supplies, with many dead and wounded among them. Yet for now, Fox Company's tattered band of Marines continued to beat back assault after assault from vastly larger forces. It was said later that their position was like an island in a sea of enemies. As the daylight of November 28th waned, General Oliver Smith at Hagaru-ri and Colonel Chesty Puller, the legendary Marine commander of the 1st Marine Regiment, positioned near Hagaru-ri, sized up the dire situation. Their forces were under attack at every location. Udamni in the west, the army units in the east, and even Hagaru-ri itself, Smith's headquarters and supply hub, had come under sniper fire and probing attacks. The Marines and soldiers were not just fighting the enemy, they were fighting the unforgiving elements too. The cold was so intense that weapons and equipment malfunctioned. Truck engines refused to start in the morning. Gun lubricants turned to jelly, causing rifles and machine guns to jam at the worst moments. Medical morphine syringes froze solid. Medics resorted to warming the morphine ampules in their mouths or armpits just to get a dose into wounded men. Blood plasma, needed for transfusions, froze into useless blocks. Soldiers wounded by gunfire sometimes had their wounds freeze, blood literally crystallizing and sealing the wound temporarily, a ghastly phenomenon that paradoxically kept some of them from bleeding to death before reaching a heated aid tent. The ground was so solidly frozen that digging foxholes or graves was nearly impossible without explosives. Marines instead piled up rocks or even stacked the frozen bodies of the fallen as sandbags to fortify their defensive lines. This was a kind of hell most of them had never imagined, a place where even nature seemed determined to kill you. Despite these grim conditions, the American commanders remained cool-headed. There is a famous anecdote that at some point in these early days, when informed that his Marines were surrounded by 22 Chinese divisions, Chesty Puller grinned and replied, "Good, now we can shoot at those fellows from every direction." That tough, defiant attitude trickled down through the ranks. Rather than despair, Marines and soldiers shared a sort of dark humor about their plight. They were determined to make the enemy pay dearly for every step. Still, the reality was stark. The UN forces had to either break out or be annihilated. A withdrawal was inevitable if they hoped to save the surrounded troops. General Smith refused to call it a retreat. He would later famously say, "Retreat? Hell! We're not retreating, we're just advancing in a different direction." For now, however, every unit had to simply survive the coming nights. The Chinese attacks would continue relentlessly. Chapter 4. Heroes and Hardship at Udamni and Fox Hill. Over the next 2 nights, November 28th to 29th and November 29th to 30th, the battle raged on around Udamni and along the road. Each sunset brought fresh onslaughts by the Chinese, and each day the Marines grimly repaired their defenses, tended to their wounded, and prepared for the next round. The perimeter at Udamni held, but barely. Mortar and artillery fire from the Marines took a heavy toll on any massed attacks. During the daytime, U.S. air support began to intervene decisively. Though the weather was bitterly cold, the clear skies allowed Marine and Navy fighter bombers, like the famous F-4U Corsairs, to swoop in. They strafed and rocketed Chinese positions, and dropped napalm which clung like fire to the frozen ground. Many embattled Marines cheered as flying boxcars, C-119 transports, also parachuted in supplies of ammunition, food, and winter clothing where they could. These airdrops were lifelines, even though some supplies fell into enemy hands by accident. The Chinese, lacking an air force, had no relief from above. They endured terrible casualties from the airstrikes. But despite losses, the enemy kept pressing. Survivors later remarked in awe that the Chinese troops showed incredible discipline and bravery. "They just kept coming," said one Marine. When one Chinese wave was cut down, another platoon or company would emerge from the tree lines to press the attack. Chinese bugle calls often signaled these renewed assaults, a sound that some veterans said haunted their nightmares for years after. At Fox Hill, Toktong Pass, Captain Barber's Fox Company continued its epic stand. By November 29th, the Marines on that hill had been fighting practically non-stop for 2 nights and 2 days. They were hungry, sleepless, and shivering, but they knew how vital their stand was. Chinese forces tried repeatedly to overrun this lone outpost controlling the mountain pass. In one pre-dawn attack, a Chinese assault party actually breached Fox Company's perimeter and charged right through the command post area. In the furious close-quarters battle that followed, Barber himself, despite his wound, and a handful of others fought them off. Private Hector Caffarata became a one-man army on the frozen slopes. Armed with his rifle and a pile of grenades, he killed dozens of enemies, and even caught enemy grenades in mid-air to throw them back. Another Marine, wounded and out of ammo, resorted to throwing rocks and fists. Every Marine on Fox Hill knew they were outnumbered by at least 10 to 1, but they refused to yield. Their defensive positions were pockmarked with shell blasts, and the ground around them was carpeted with spent cartridges and frozen bodies. For 5 days, Fox Company held firm against everything the Chinese threw at them. Their valor would later earn several of these men the Medal of Honor and other awards. And Fox Hill would go down in Marine Corps legend as an Alamo-like stand. Except in this case, the defenders survived. Meanwhile, recognizing the plight of Fox Company, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis led a daring rescue effort. Davis was commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, back at Udamni. On December 1st, he took his battalion on an arduous flanking march across icy ridges and through knee-deep snow in an attempt to reach Fox Company. Navigating in extreme cold through unmapped mountain terrain, Davis's men climbed and crawled for hours. At one point, they ran into a Chinese camp and surprised it with an attack, clearing the way. After an exhausting push, Lieutenant Colonel Davis's battalion arrived just in time to relieve the battered Fox Company on December 2nd. The sight was unforgettable. Out of Fox Company's original 220 men, only about 80 could still walk and fight. The rest were dead or injured. Captain Barber, weak from blood loss and barely able to stand, greeted the relief force with immense relief and pride. His men had held the pass, and now finally they could be evacuated and regrouped. For his leadership and courage, William Barber would later receive the Medal of Honor, as would Hector Caffarata and Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis, among others. Such acts of heroism were the glimmers of light in the otherwise dark chaos of Chosin. By the beginning of December, the Marines at Udumne had managed to hold their ground and even consolidate their units somewhat. However, it was clear that remaining there was suicide. The Chinese had effectively cut off further advance north. Any thought of reaching the Yalu River was abandoned. The priority now was saving the surrounded forces. On December 1st, General Smith got the go-ahead to execute a fighting withdrawal from Udumne back to Hagaru-ri. In classic Marine fashion, this withdrawal would be conducted as an offensive operation, essentially an attack in reverse. They would not run. They would methodically fight their way south, taking their wounded, their vehicles, and as much heavy equipment as possible. The Marines were insistent that no wounded man would be left behind to the enemy. So they loaded trucks with the injured, and those too badly hurt to survive a rough truck ride were gathered at Hagaru-ri, where an airstrip had been secretly under construction. Now, before we follow the Marines' breakout, we must address the fate of their comrades on the east side of Chosin, the men of Task Force Faith who had been facing their own nightmare. Chapter 5. East of Chosin. The Ordeal of Task Force Faith. While the Marines stabilized their defense in the west, Task Force Faith, officially the 31st Regimental Combat Team on the east shore of Chosin, was in dire straits. From November 27th onward, they had been assailed by multiple Chinese divisions without any break. These were mostly U.S. Army troops, including the 31st and 32nd Infantry Regiments, along with a battalion of field artillery, about 3,000 men, spread along a narrow road by the reservoir's edge. They lacked the numbers and perhaps the cohesive experience of the Marines, and they were cut off from the rest of 10th Corps, except by radio. The Chinese concentrated on annihilating this force first. Over several nights, as temperatures plunged and ammunition dwindled, Task Force Faith's perimeter shrank under unceasing attack. Lieutenant Colonel Don C. Faith, Jr., a young Army officer, had assumed command after Colonel McLean was captured. He rallied his soldiers to keep fighting, even as their situation became nearly hopeless. They defended a position known as Sinhung-ni and nearby hills, attempting to hold until help could arrive. But help was not coming. The Marines were too hard-pressed to send major relief to the east side. On December 1st, Lieutenant Colonel Faith finally decided their only chance was to fight their way south toward Hagaru-ri, just as the Marines were doing from the west. They formed a convoy of trucks, loaded with as many wounded as possible, and those still able to fight, took up positions around the column. In a scene of tragic bravery, these soldiers began a breakout march along the road skirting the reservoir. Chinese roadblocks and ambushes turned the retreat into a slaughter. In freezing daylight, the column was hit from high ground by machine gun and mortar fire. Men fell by the dozens. Wrecked trucks clogged the road. When the convoy reached a damaged bridge, they had to abandon vehicles and proceed on foot across the ice of the reservoir itself. During one fierce engagement, Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith was mortally wounded by a grenade while leading from the front. He died as his men dragged him off the road. He would later be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership and sacrifice. Small groups of survivors continued to trudge towards Hagaru-ri, carrying or helping wounded comrades. Out of the roughly 3,000 in Task Force Faith, only about 1,000 made it out of the eastern shore alive, and most of them were wounded or severely frostbitten. The majority of the unit was killed or captured in that heartbreaking withdrawal. A handful of frostbitten, Exhausted army soldiers stumbled into the Hagaru-ri perimeter on December 2nd and 3rd, where Marines were shocked by their condition. These were among the last survivors of Task Force Faith, and they brought stories of incredible suffering and courage under fire. Though their stand was largely overshadowed by the Marine story, the soldiers of Task Force Faith fought bravely in impossible circumstances, buying precious time by tying down large Chinese forces. Their sacrifice meant fewer Chinese troops could concentrate against the Marines to the west. The tragedy of Task Force Faith is an integral part of the Chosin story. It underscores just how desperate the situation was and how high the cost of this battle would be. Chapter 6. Hagaru-ri, Lifeline in the Mountains. Throughout this chaos, the crossroads of Hagaru-ri had become a focal point. Hagaru-ri was a small village at the southern tip of the reservoir, where several valleys and roads converged. General Smith had wisely ordered an airfield to be built there in November, anticipating that air supply or evacuation might be needed. By sheer determination, Marine engineers and Seabees, construction units, worked night and day under sporadic enemy fire to carve a short runway out of the frozen earth. On December 1st, even as Chinese forces pressed in on Hagaru-ri from surrounding hills, the airstrip became operational. The first transport planes, C-47 Skytrains, landed amid enemy shellfire, bringing in supplies and taking out the most critically wounded men. This narrow, hastily built strip would prove a godsend. Over the next week, some 4,000 wounded Marines and soldiers were evacuated by air from Hagaru-ri, sparing them almost certain death if they had to stay in the cold or attempt the march. Those planes also brought in reinforcements. A battalion of Army infantry was flown in to help hold Hagaru's perimeter, and a few dozen British Royal Marines commandos as well, who happened to be in the theatre. The international aspect of the UN force showed here. Americans, South Koreans, British, all fighting shoulder to shoulder in that shrinking defensive circle around Hagaru-ri. Hagaru-ri itself came under heavy Chinese attack on the night of November 28th, and again on November 29th. The defenders, which included service troops, engineers, and any stragglers available, fought back ferociously. Even cooks and clerks took up rifles to hold the line. Notably, a small force of Royal Marine commandos held part of the perimeter, contributing their share to the defense. The Brits were seasoned, mountain warfare troops, and proved invaluable. The perimeter was relatively small. You could walk across it in a matter of minutes, but it held despite several breaches. In one dramatic episode, a Chinese assault penetrated near the engineers' area. American artillerymen swung their howitzers around to fire directly at point-blank range, blasting the attackers out of the wire. By dawn, Hagaru-ri was still in American hands, though at great cost. As units from Udamni and survivors from the eastern flank slowly converged on Hagaru-ri in early December, the base became a congested sanctuary. Tents were overflowing with wounded men awaiting evacuation. Campfires dotted the area as troops tried to warm themselves and melt snow for water. One Marine later remarked that the whole valley smelled of gunpowder, blood, and diesel exhaust. The odors of war mixed with the biting cold of the mountains. General Oliver Smith and his staff coordinated the next phase, the breakout from the reservoir area altogether and a fighting withdrawal south to the sea. With communications restored, Smith was in contact with Lieutenant General Almond and even General MacArthur's headquarters. The order was clear. 10th Corps, the forces in northeast Korea, would retreat to the port of Hungnam, where the US Navy would evacuate them by ship if possible. It was a daunting prospect. The Marines and soldiers at Chosin were about 70 miles inland, high up in the mountains. To reach Hungnam, they would have to descend that entire distance along the same treacherous road they had come up, through a narrow defile called Funchilin Pass, and a place ominously nicknamed Hellfire Valley, and they would likely be pursued and attacked every step of the way by the Chinese. However, the men at Chosin were undeterred. Many of them had a sardonic refrain. "We're just attacking in another direction." They prepared to move out, not as a panicked retreat, but as a disciplined withdrawal with full intent to engage the enemy all the way. On December 6th, the consolidated force at Hagaru-ri, roughly 10,000 Marines, along with several thousand Army troops, the 3rd Infantry Division units, holding the lower road, had moved up to assist, formed into a column, and began the journey southward. They carried all their operable vehicles, heavy weapons, and as many supplies as possible. Trucks were packed with the wounded who had not been flown out. Those who could still fight took up positions in the convoy, a protective formation of tanks at the front and rear, riflemen walking alongside or riding on trucks, and artillery pieces in tow, ready to fire in support. It was an awe-inspiring sight in a way. A frozen, grim procession of men determined to march to the sea, carrying their dead and wounded, refusing to leave anyone behind. Some dubbed it a moving perimeter, a 17-mile-long convoy that bristled with rifles and guns, ready to fend off attacks from any direction. Chapter 7. The Fighting Withdrawal. Attack in a different direction. The trek from Hagaru-ri to the coast would take about 5 days of vicious fighting. The road was precarious, narrow, twisting along cliffs and through steep valleys. Early on the morning of December 6th, as the long column snaked out of Hagaru-ri, the Chinese were waiting. They had set up roadblocks and ambushes at natural choke points along the route. One of the first major firefights erupted in a stretch that later came to be called Hellfire Valley. Chinese troops had occupied high ground overlooking a canyon through which the road ran. As the lead elements of Marines entered this valley, gunfire and mortar shells rained down. A blazing ambush ensued. Trucks were hit and set aflame. Casualties fell left and right. The narrow defile echoed with explosions and rifle reports. It truly seemed like a valley of hellfire as the Marines fought desperately to clear the heights. One veteran recalled that it took them 24 hours of continuous combat to break through the roadblock and silence the Chinese positions in Hellfire Valley. Inch by inch, they assaulted the hills with bayonets and grenades, often engaging in brutal close combat. Eventually, through sheer grit and with support from the ever-present Marine Corsair fighter planes above, they blasted open the passage and the convoy rolled on. During the march, the nights were especially perilous. On the night of December 6th to 7th, the column halted in defensive posture to rest. That night turned out to be the coldest night of the entire campaign. Temperatures plunged to around -40 degrees Fahrenheit, -40 degrees Celsius, under a clear, starry sky. The men had to huddle together in foxholes or whatever shelter they could find, wrapping themselves in any available blankets or climbing into sleeping bags in shifts. If they stayed alone or stationary too long, they risked freezing solid. One Marine said you could hear the groans of frost-bitten men and the distant chatter of enemy activity in the darkness. A particularly bright star shone in the sky over the pass that night, which some Marines poetically nicknamed the Star of Koto-ri. It lifted their spirits a little, a sign that perhaps they would find deliverance. And indeed, with dawn came clearing weather and the blessed roar of air support. U.S. Air Force and Marine aircraft bombed and strafed any Chinese formations they could spot, keeping many enemies at bay during the daytime. But the Chinese were still determined to finish off the UN forces. As the retreating column approached Funchilin Pass, a critical obstacle emerged. Funchilin Pass was a steep, treacherous section of the road featuring a narrow gorge crossed by a concrete bridge, actually a series of connected bridge sections over a deep chasm. Recognizing this choke point, Chinese sappers had blown up the bridge on December 5th, sending a section of it plunging into the ravine. When the Marines arrived, they found a 50-foot gap in the road. Below it, an icy river roared at the bottom of the gorge. This looked like a showstopper. How could trucks, tanks, and jeeps carrying thousands of wounded possibly cross? For a moment, despair threatened. Being stuck here would make them sitting ducks. But once again, ingenuity and air power saved the day. In an unprecedented improvisation, the U.S. Air Force had flown in 8 portable bridge sections, prefabricated bridge blocks, each weighing a ton, and parachute-dropped them near the site. Amazingly, these huge metal panels floated down by parachute onto the frozen ground, and Marine engineers quickly bolted them together to create a makeshift span. Working under fire and in the numbing cold, they repaired the gap sufficiently for vehicles to carefully drive across. The Marines later quipped that it was as if Providence and the Air Force built them, a bridge to freedom. Had it not been for those portable bridge sections, they might have truly been stranded. With the bridge restored, the long line of men and machines cautiously crept over the gorge. Tanks went first to ensure the bridge held, then truck after truck loaded with the wounded made the crossing. This dramatic engineering feat happened on December 7th, a date already hallowed in American memory as Pearl Harbor Day, and it felt like a fitting reversal of fortune. Beyond Funchilin Pass, the road descended through more winding valleys toward a place called Kotori, where another regrouping was done. Kotori had been held by a rearguard of Marines, and by December 7th, the main column linked up with them. Now the full remaining strength of the 1st Marine Division and attached units was together. Rest was brief. They pressed on, fighting through smaller road ambushes and sniper fire. Chinese forces were still shadowing them on the high ridges, occasionally cutting off stragglers or launching harassing attacks on the tail of the column. But the worst was behind them. On December 8th and 9th, they broke through the last Chinese blocking positions north of a village called Chinhum-ni. There, units of the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division were waiting in relative safety, having kept the road open from that point to the port. When the men who had survived Chosin reached the lines of the 3rd Infantry, there were emotional scenes. Army soldiers, who had heard of the fierce fight, welcomed the frostbitten Marines with hot coffee, blankets, and even tears of relief and admiration. Everyone knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. Finally, over the next couple of days, the entire 10-corps force, Marines, Army, and small contingents of British and South Korean troops, made it down to the port of Hungnam on the Sea of Japan. They brought with them all their wounded, and even most of their dead. Against all odds, they had also managed to bring out virtually all their operable equipment, from trucks and artillery to tanks, refusing to give the enemy any freebies. The evacuation at Hungnam was a massive undertaking. Dozens of US Navy and Allied ships stood offshore. Starting on December 11th and over the following week or so, those ships took aboard not just the battle-weary troops, but also a vast number of Korean refugees who had fled south with the UN forces. The men of Chosin, despite their fatigue, helped carry civilian families, women, children, the elderly, onto the vessels. By Christmas Eve, Hungnam's harbor would see one of the greatest sea lift evacuations in military history, often compared to Dunkirk in World War II. But by December 13th, the frontline fighting for Chosin was effectively over. The Chinese had been kept at bay long enough for the bulk of UN forces to sail away. Chapter 8. Aftermath. Legends forged in ice and blood. As the last ship pulled away from Hungnam, the Battle of Chosin Reservoir passed into history. But its legacy was only beginning. The survivors, later honored with the nickname the Chosin Few, had accomplished a feat of arms and endurance that would be studied and celebrated for generations. In military terms, the battle was a complex outcome. Tactically, the Chinese had pushed the UN out of North Korea. Strategically, the UN forces had avoided annihilation and lived to fight another day. The casualties were staggering on both sides. American 10th Corps suffered thousands of losses, roughly 3,000 killed, around 6,000 wounded, and an additional 7,000+ non-battle casualties, mostly frostbite and cold injuries. Many of those evacuated with severe frostbite would lose fingers, toes, or limbs to amputation. Yet, they survived, and that itself seemed miraculous given the circumstances. The Chinese 9th Army Group paid an even heavier price for their victory at Chosin. Out of approximately 120,000 Chinese soldiers committed, an estimated 25,000 to 30,000 were killed in action, and as many or more were incapacitated by the unforgiving cold, starvation, and frostbite. It's said that around 30,000 Chinese may have died from cold exposure alone, never mind the ones fallen to bullets and bombs. In fact, the Chinese losses were so severe that the entire 9th Army Group was unable to fight again for months afterward. They had effectively spent themselves to achieve the Chosin encirclement. Mao Zedong even lost a personal stake. His eldest son, Mao En-ying, was killed by an airstrike during this offensive, not at Chosin itself, but in the broader campaign. For the United States, the Chosin battle quickly became the stuff of legend. Newspapers dubbed the retreat the greatest withdrawal in history, a fighting retreat that saved 10th Corps from destruction. The Marines, in particular, emerged with an enhanced reputation. Their motto, "No Marine left behind," seemed earned in blood and ice. 17 Americans were awarded the Medal of Honor for actions during the Chosin Reservoir battle, an incredible number for a single engagement, symbolizing just how many acts of valor had occurred in those 2 weeks. Among them were Captain William Barber and Private Hector Cafferata of Fox Company, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis, who rescued Fox Company, Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith of the Army, posthumously, and many others who led charges, covered retreats, or sacrificed themselves to save comrades. Countless more received Navy Crosses, Silver Stars, and other honors. But beyond medals, it was the stories told by the men that cemented Chosin's place in history. Stories of buddies who carried wounded friends on their backs for miles, of doctors treating dozens of frostbite victims with little more than hope and morphine, of gunners who fired their last shells point blank at charging enemies, of frozen boots, frozen rifles, and unfrozen spirit. The battle's outcome had a sobering effect on American war aims. After Chosin, it was clear that the war in Korea would not be over by Christmas 1950. Instead, it dragged on until 1953, eventually ending in a stalemate around the original dividing line at the 38th parallel. General MacArthur's predictions of an easy win were shattered, and his aggressive proposals to expand the war against China led to his dismissal by President Truman a few months later. The Chosin Reservoir fight demonstrated the peril of underestimating one's enemy, but it also demonstrated the incredible resilience of the American fighting man in even the most dire circumstances. From the frozen Chosin emerged a legacy of heroism. The survivors returned home, or to the lines further south, with tales that hardly seemed believable. Many of these men had grown up during the Great Depression and fought in World War II. They thought they had seen hardship, but Chosin was an entirely new level of trial. Veterans would forever recall the camaraderie and courage that got them through those nights. One Marine said later, "At Chosin, we weren't just fighting the Chinese, we were fighting the cold, the terrain, and our own fears. And we beat them all." In reunions years afterward, the old soldiers and Marines would greet each other as the Chosin Few, instantly bonded by the memory of that frozen mountainside and the brothers they lost there. They joke that after Korea, many of them moved to warm climates. They'd had enough of winter for a lifetime. For the Marine Corps, Chosin became a defining moment, taught to every recruit as an example of determination and esprit de corps. The phrase, "retreat hell," lives on, epitomizing the fighting spirit that even in withdrawal, they would not consider themselves defeated. Indeed, historians have noted that while the Chinese won a territorial gravity, the withdrawal from Chosin was a Pyrrhic victory for China. Their forces were so blooded that the UN forces eventually stabilized the front in South Korea. In the annals of American history, Chosin stands alongside battles like Thermopylae or the Alamo in terms of bravery. Except that unlike those doomed stands, the Chosin story is ultimately one of survival and triumph against the odds. As we conclude this epic tale, picture one final scene. It's Christmas Eve, 1950. A US Navy transport ship is sailing away from Hungnam, filled with Marines and soldiers from the Chosin battle. Many are wounded, nearly all are bone-tired. On the deck, a group of them stand watching the Korean coastline recede. They are bundled in mismatched cold weather gear, bandages on their hands or heads, their faces gaunt and wind-burned. These young men have lived through a nightmare and are forever changed by it. Perhaps they think of the buddies who didn't make it out of the mountains. Perhaps they simply thank God they have a hot meal and a warm bunk waiting below. One turns to another and says, "Well, we made it out of that frozen hell." The other, managing a slight grin, replies, "Hell of a way to spend Christmas, eh?" They share a quiet laugh, born of relief and the unbreakable bond of those who endured the impossible together. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir was over, but the legend had only begun. In that frozen hell, American heroes were indeed forged like steel, tempered in fire and ice. Their story of loyalty, bravery, and endurance against all odds will continue to inspire future generations. When faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges, one can remember the men at Chosin and know that with courage and unity, even the most dire situations can be overcome. The Chosin few proved that true valor shines brightest in the darkest, coldest hour.